The Eastern Front offered unique challenges to the German army, especially in logistics. Logistics is crucial to the conduct of warfare. In turn, military planners have to take careful consideration of roads. Thousands of years earlier, the Roman army identified the importance of quality roads. When not on campaign, legionaries labored extensively to construct lengthy roads for not just ease of communication but troop movement. By the 20th century, hard surface roads were everywhere in most of Europe and were taken for granted by most Europeans. The Germans were no exception to this, and subconsciously assumed that there would also be adequate roads in Western Russia. In contrast to Western Europe, many roads in Russia lacked hard surfaces, failed to connect, suffered from poor drainage, and were even incomplete. Yet many German maps indicated their existence. In fact, many roads between rural towns were merely created by a combination of vehicles running persistent routes across terrain and the natural elements. As a result, some roads were almost 100 yards wide. While this may seem advantageous at first, it would demand major traffic control when these roads led to bridges and towns, which had narrow paths and threatened to create massive bottlenecks. Tracked vehicles were highly desired in muddy terrain which wheeled vehicles had a difficult time traversing. However, most of the motorized vehicles in a Panzer division were wheeled, and almost all of the available tracked vehicles were allotted exclusively to combat and recovery units. As a result, the supply trucks, for example, under certain weather conditions, could not use the same routes as the forward combat units with tracked vehicles. Near forested areas, German rear units could chop down trees and use the lumber to construct corduroy roads. However, this option was not available in many areas of Russia, where trees were sparse. When the opportunity presented itself, the work was very labor-intensive. Where possible, the Germans employed Russian locals to help with the construction of these wooden paths. The guarantee of hot meals made these opportunities attractive for many starving Russian civilians. Ukraine in particular had fertile black soil that often tricked German motorists into thinking that the soil was asphalt. On dry days, the soil did act like asphalt because it was compacted by the weight of motorized vehicle columns and permitted speeds of up to 45 miles per hour. However, as soon as it started to rain, the so-called roads would turn into rivers of soapy mud. This not only threatened to slow down German vehicle columns, but caused many vehicles to be completely stuck. In response, many German commanders and military policemen had to construct barriers, signposts, and wave down motorists to prevent them from driving on certain roads as soon as it started raining. Over time, the experienced German drivers learned to stop driving and get off the road as soon as it started raining. Marching regulations and traffic control policies were often left to the discretion of the unit commander. German commanders relied on reconnaissance units and unit map-making detachments for accurate maps and reports of bridges, roads, available space, and terrain. Only then can a unit commander give the appropriate orders and assign traffic control. According to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, timely advance route reconnaissance was frequently neglected by both commanders and troops during the early phases of the German invasion of Russia. The fact that German troops were accustomed to more favorable terrain and weather conditions in other theaters of operation probably contributed to this initial laxity. That mobile warfare and movement of armor in European Russia could be conducted successfully only after thorough advanced reconnaissance was one of the first lessons the Germans had to learn. In a Panzer division, there were roughly 50 military policemen, most of whom had civilian law enforcement and traffic control jobs back at home. The military police detachment had other duties, such as keeping order and processing POWs. Worsened by sickness and combat losses, there were often very few traffic control posts set up by the military police. At the same time, many MPs had to be held back in reserve in case of emergencies and sudden changes of circumstances. As a result, many supply staff units and regular soldiers had to fulfill duties of traffic control and POW escort. According to the U.S. Army Library, a traffic control post was normally composed of 4 MPs, a messenger, 2 light personnel carriers, likely Kugelwagens, and 1 motorcycle. In unusual situations or under extremely critical circumstances, traffic control elements of a military police battalion from a higher headquarters were sometimes placed at the disposal of an armored division in platoon or company strength for limited periods or within specific areas. Eventually, MP detachments were equipped with armored personnel carriers, half-track motorcycles such as the Kettenkrad, and more maneuverable trucks in order to improve protection and off-road mobility. MPs in the German army were armed with submachine guns and wore conspicuous chest insignia signifying themselves as Feldgendarmerie, earning them their nickname of Kettenhunde, meaning chained dogs. They spent most of their days outside, even in harsh weather, directing traffic as well as painting and nailing signposts. While military police exercised external enforcement of traffic regulations on other units, commanders within those units exercised internal enforcement of traffic regulations and delegated traffic control tasks to regular troops. According to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, March units in combat had to post their own guides at highway intersections and road forks until the tail of the column had passed, whereupon they were responsible for erecting signs and markers for march elements which had fallen behind. Effective road marking became increasingly important during the course of operations since it minimized the need of keeping guides on duty for extended periods. This supplementary traffic control personnel should not be confused with the regular military police traffic details. The former were not specially trained troops but were messengers and other line soldiers chosen arbitrarily from each march unit for this temporary assignment. On the march, MPs were often sent forward ahead of the main columns and directed traffic in order to prevent delays. At key intersections and bridges, traffic control posts also facilitated vehicle maintenance and recovery in addition to a complement of military police. By providing vehicle maintenance and recovery at the location, vehicle breakdowns and collisions can be immediately removed to prevent traffic jams. In addition, radios and telephones were utilized in order to maintain two-way communication with higher headquarters, combat units, and supply units. Depending on how busy the road was, there were fuel distribution personnel and ambulances ready to deal with emergencies. In the winter, medical personnel administered heated shelters at these locations as rear area casualty collection points to prevent losses from severe cold. This required coordination and cooperation from a variety of military services. The Germans would normally appoint an energetic company-grade officer to administer this system. At the beginning of the war, this was an emergency impromptu position. Eventually, this became an official staff officer position known as Stabsoffizier für Marschüberwachung, meaning staff officer for marching regulations. This person was responsible for all aspects of traffic control and, depending on the unit commander, was able to call upon a variety of units including military police, signals troops, field kitchen, supply troops, and engineers. Only in dire circumstances would combat troops be put under his command. At bridges and other river crossings, there were similar setups, with the likely addition of flak, meaning anti-air, platoons and larger military police units depending on the magnitude of the traffic. Bridges with heavy traffic were vulnerable to air attack, but concentrated anti-air fire at small groups of bombers was sufficient protection. The majority of lanes across bridges and their approaches were dedicated to a single direction, especially when large German units were withdrawing. Both maximum and minimum speeds were strictly enforced. The military police went to great lengths to ensure order and that no vehicle stopped when on or approaching the bridge. Messenger vehicles and casualties were given priority when moving across bridges and had the freedom to move in either direction without hindrance. A great deal of bridging personnel were kept in reserve when emergencies such as collisions and riots broke out. Oftentimes, emergencies did occur, including the crossing of oversized military hardware on short notice. The movement of Tiger tanks, for example, often forced the Germans to block the movement of traffic from the opposite direction. Roads often needed to be improved immediately while an advance was in progress. German engineers known as Pionieren could perform this task efficiently, but commanders wanted them to be prioritized for tasks in combat. As a result, service troops performed road works and road maintenance. They proved to be effective provided that they were fully convinced of the necessity of their work. Over time, these became more adept and efficient at this job after being consistently assigned to this line of work. This goes to show how effective leadership not only communicates orders and intent clearly, but also makes sure subordinates understand why their work is important. By doing so, the Germans were able to do more with less without having the burdens of rear area service hamper frontline combat operations. In the summer of 1941, the German 17th and 6th Armies of Army Group South succeeded in pushing the Red Army past the Dnieper River. However, the Red Army maintained control of the vital bridgeheads across the river. 1st Panzer Division was diverted south to reinforce the German forces fighting for control of the bridgehead near Cherkassi. On the 25th of July, the division moved from Mironovka to Cherkassi. At the head of one of the division's marching columns was the forward elements of its Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, which reached the northern outskirts of Svidovok, 6 miles north of Cherkassi. The marching column was stopped by heavy Soviet resistance and various anti-tank weaponry. In addition, it was battered by air attack and Soviet gun emplacements firing upon them from the east bank of the Dnieper River. At 1100 hours, the column reported that they had lost 50% of its men and material, while Soviet forces in the area were still strong. The marching column of the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion was ordered to remain at Svidovok and maintain pressure on the Russian defenses in order to tie down those forces and prevent them from being moved to other sectors of the front. Meanwhile, the second march column of the division reached Majny, but its panzers could not advance any further after they realized that the eastern embankment was too steep. In addition, the rain had made certain roads and the nearby ford impassable. At 1500 hours, the first marching column, the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, was rerouted. An hour later, the second march column was also rerouted, along with the other 3 of the 5 marching columns of the division. Traffic in certain directions and along certain roads had to be blocked and rerouted. Units of the 1st Panzer Division as a result failed to meet their destinations according to schedule, and the entire division was unable to launch its attack against the Cherkassi bridgehead until the 26th of July, the following day. Fortunately, the Red Air Force did not harass the German columns on their new alternate route, and the traffic control system employed by the Germans helped to speed up the rerouting process. From this, the U.S. Army Research Journal concluded that the German delays were caused by failure of properly reconnoitering the terrain and roads ahead of the German advance, underscoring the importance of forward reconnaissance and traffic control, especially when columns of vehicles needed to be rerouted. German traffic control operated most smoothly in the summer. In all other seasons, it struggled, and the role of military police was of greater importance, especially in the autumn and spring, when muddy conditions were common. In the winter, heavy snowfall hampered the movement of vehicles and would occasionally disable vehicles entirely. MPs and recovery teams had to work round the clock to restore the movement of German vehicle columns. With the help of small-scale improvisations such as snowplows, the German vehicles could barely reach their objectives at the scheduled time. It was often assumed that a supply column would have no trouble using the same route that a forward unit had previously used. However, weather conditions such as rain or snowfall would physically alter the road to the point where it was impassable, leaving many forward units unsupplied and unable to advance. This was worsened by the fact that German engines and fuel had poor resistance to the cold, adding mechanical failure to the list of troubles German units would encounter when simply moving their military hardware. After the German 17th and 6th Armies crossed the Dnieper and advanced towards the area west of Kharkov by mid-October 1941, the Soviets tried to make a desperate defense in order to buy time for the evacuation of industrial hardware in Kharkov. At this time, the 2nd Panzer Division was resting west of Poltava, replenishing itself with reinforcements and supplies. On the evening of October 15th, it was ordered to break camp and advance 80 miles to the Staraya, Vodolaga, Minkovka, Novaya, Vodolaga area by October 16th. Excluding the supply services, the 2nd Panzer Division formed up into 5 large columns and moved into position using the same route other units had been using earlier. As a result, the Germans felt that forward reconnaissance was not necessary. The first column reached Voinovka at 1,000 hours and reported that many of its vehicles were completely stuck in deep mud. Worse, many vehicles were disabled and blocking traffic, creating traffic jams for dozens of miles. The Germans assessed their situation, gathered their engineers, prime movers, military police, maintenance teams, and recovery teams to get the vehicles moving. Despite this, the delays persisted, and the last German column to reach its destination did so on October 17th, a full day later than planned. Roughly a quarter of its equipment was put out of action, hampering its ability to conduct offensive operations. This explains why many German officers cast a great deal of blame on the weather for Operation Barbarossa's failure to meet expectations. Combined with an overestimation of the quality of roads in Russia, as well as an underestimation of their foe, the chances of victory for the German forces in Russia were further diminished.